Part 3. Rasmus walked into the kitchen, his mind racing with the implications of their conversation. The images from his dream, the humanoid figures, the capsule, were still vivid in his mind, clinging to him like a fog that wouldn't lift. He needed a moment to clear his head, to shake the feeling of being trapped in that strange place. "Excuse me," Rasmus muttered, walking toward the bathroom in the back of the house. He could feel the weight of the conversation still hanging in the air, but he needed to do something to snap out of it. The dream felt too real, too strange, and he wanted to ground himself in something ordinary. He turned on the faucet and splashed cold water onto his face, hoping it would bring some clarity. But as he stood there, wiping his face with a towel, he noticed something strange, a tingling sensation spreading across his skin. At first, it was just a light prickling, something he could easily dismiss. But it grew stronger, like something was pressing against his skin from the inside. His breath caught in his throat as his hand moved instinctively to his shoulder, where the sensation was the most intense. Rasmus pulled up the hem of his t-shirt, revealing the bare skin of his shoulder. His eyes widened in disbelief as he saw it. 2 small puncture marks, neat, almost surgical, sat just beneath the curve of his shoulder blade, slightly raised, as though they had been made recently. They were identical to the marks that had appeared on the animals on his farm, the ones that had vanished and reappeared with the same 2 punctures. His heart skipped a beat as he stood frozen, staring at the marks. They were unmistakable. He had no idea how they had gotten there, but there was no denying it now. The same strange phenomenon that had been affecting the animals was now happening to him. Rasmus quickly pulled his shirt back down, his mind racing with questions. How could this be? He hadn't been anywhere near the animals during the nights when they disappeared, and yet here he was, with the same exact marks that had appeared on them. He didn't waste any time. His feet carried him back to the living room, where Michael was still sitting at the table, his brow furrowed in thought. Rasmus stood in the doorway for a moment, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. "Mike?" His voice was shaky, his mind still trying to process the sight he had just seen. Michael looked up, his face filled with concern. "Rasmus? What's wrong?" Without saying a word, Rasmus pulled up his shirt again, revealing the 2 puncture marks on his shoulder. Michael's eyes went wide with shock as he stepped forward, his gaze locked on the identical marks. "What the hell?" Michael muttered, his voice barely audible. "How did this happen?" Rasmus shook his head, his mind still spinning. "I don't know, Mike. I don't know how it happened, but I can't deny it. These marks, they're the same as the ones on the animals, and I didn't do anything to get them, I swear." Michael stepped back, his hand running through his hair as he tried to make sense of what they were facing. This is too much. First the animals, then the dreams, and now you? This isn't just coincidence anymore, Rasmus. We're dealing with something. We don't understand." Rasmus let out a slow breath, trying to steady himself. "I know, Mike. I know, but we need to figure this out. Something's happening to us, and it's not just dreams anymore. These marks, they're proof of it." Michael's expression grew more serious, his eyes narrowing in determination. "This is exactly what we were afraid of. We're not just being watched anymore. They're doing something to us, and we need to find out what before it's too late." Rasmus didn't respond right away. He just stood there, trying to absorb the reality of the situation. The marks, the strange occurrences, the fear creeping into every corner of his mind. He had been thinking about this for days, but now that it was happening to him too, it felt all too real. "We need to keep our heads together," Michael continued, his voice resolute. "Whatever this is, we need to stay ahead of it. We can't let them control us like they've been doing with the animals." Rasmus nodded, though doubt still lingered in his eyes. "But what if it's already too late? What if they've already started with us?" Michael's jaw clenched as he stared at Rasmus, trying to fight off the fear that threatened to overtake him. "We don't know that yet, but we need to find out, and we need to do it fast." The 2 men stood in silence, the weight of the situation settling over them like a thick fog. Whatever was happening, it was no longer just a mystery. It was a threat, and they were at its mercy. Rasmus sat in the driver's seat of his truck, his fingers tapping nervously on the steering wheel. The marks on his shoulder still itched, though he couldn't tell if it was from the strange sensation he'd felt earlier or the creeping anxiety that was gnawing at him. He needed answers, and as much as he hated the idea of going to a clinic, he knew he had to do something. The idea that his body was being marked, just like the animals, was gnawing at him. He couldn't ignore it. He had debated telling Michael, but after their last conversation, Rasmus knew he had to take the first step on his own. Maybe the doctors could explain the marks. Maybe they couldn't, but he needed to be sure there was nothing physical that could explain it away. The clinic wasn't far from his farm, just a short drive down a winding stretch of rural road. When he finally arrived, he was greeted by the sterile, unfeeling atmosphere of the small medical center. He walked in, and after filling out the usual forms, he was led into a small exam room where he waited for what felt like an eternity. His mind raced, but he tried to focus, forcing himself to calm down. He couldn't go in there sounding crazy, talking about alien marks or anything remotely out of the ordinary. When the door finally opened, the doctor, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on her nose, stepped in with a clipboard in her hands. She gave Rasmus a polite but distant smile as she set the clipboard down. "So what seems to be the issue?" she asked, her voice friendly but clinical. Rasmus hesitated for a moment, then pulled up the sleeve of his shirt, revealing the 2 puncture marks on his shoulder. He hadn't gotten a good look at them since he'd first noticed them earlier, but now, under the fluorescent lights of the clinic, they seemed less pronounced, though still visible. I've noticed these marks on my shoulder," Rasmus began, his voice a bit uncertain. "I don't know how I got them, but they just appeared. I was hoping you could tell me what they are." The doctor leaned in to take a closer look, her brow furrowing slightly as she examined the marks. She didn't seem alarmed, but her curiosity was piqued. She muttered. "They're not very deep, but they are definitely unusual. Have you been bitten by anything recently? A bug, perhaps?" Rasmus shook his head, trying to keep his tone casual. "No, nothing like that. I don't think it's an insect bite." The doctor looked back at the marks, then at Rasmus. "Well, we'd have to run some tests if you're worried, but from what I can see, it doesn't look like anything serious. The punctures are shallow, more like a pinprick than a deep wound. They don't appear to be infected either." Rasmus frowned. "But do you have any idea how they might have happened?" She shrugged. "Could be anything. A scrape, an accident you don't remember. Maybe even a bite from a small animal. People don't always notice those kinds of things. I wouldn't worry too much about it. There's no sign of anything dangerous here, though if it bothers you, we could keep an eye on it." Rasmus could feel a knot tighten in his stomach. The doctor didn't know what was happening, but the way she brushed it off only made the whole situation feel worse. He didn't want to sound paranoid, but this wasn't a simple bug bite or a random accident. "Are you sure?" he asked, still looking at the marks on his shoulder. "You don't think it's anything, like, more serious?" The doctor smiled reassuringly. "I really don't think so. If it were an infection or something dangerous, you'd likely feel more symptoms, pain, redness, swelling. It doesn't seem like that at all. I'd recommend keeping an eye on it for the next few days, but I don't see anything here that warrants concern." Rasmus felt a wave of frustration wash over him. He wanted to tell her what was really going on, about the strange lights, the disappearing animals, the weird dreams. But he knew better than to mention that. If he told her that, she'd just send him to a psychologist or a mental health specialist, and that wasn't going to help him. Not now. Not with everything that was at stake. "Okay," he said after a long pause, forcing a tight smile. "Thanks for your time, Doc. Of course, let me know if anything changes, all right?" She gathered her things and left the room, leaving Rasmus to sit with his thoughts. He walked out of the clinic feeling more unsettled than ever. The marks were still there, but the doctor hadn't given him any concrete answers. He didn't know if he should feel relieved or more anxious. One thing was for certain. This wasn't over. And whatever was happening to him, whatever was happening to the animals, to the farm, to everything around him, it was growing more real with every passing day. Rasmus returned to his truck and drove home, his mind whirling. When he got back to Michael's farm, he didn't even need to explain. Michael could see it in his face. Rasmus stepped out of the truck, and Michael was already waiting for him at the door. The concern etched across his features. "So, what did they say?" Michael asked, his voice laced with anxiety. Rasmus didn't answer immediately. He climbed the steps and entered the house, Michael following closely behind. Once inside, Rasmus stood still for a moment before finally turning to face Michael. "They didn't find anything wrong," Rasmus said, his voice heavy. "The doctor said the marks are shallow, nothing too deep. She said it could be a bite or something, but she didn't seem concerned. Just told me to keep an eye on it." Michael's frown deepened. "That's it?" Rasmus nodded. "Yeah, she didn't think it was anything serious. But I know it's not just a bite, Mike. Something's going on, and I don't think she gets it. I don't think anyone does." Michael's gaze hardened as he looked at Rasmus. "I don't like this, Rasmus. I don't like it one bit." Rasmus exhaled sharply. "I don't either, Mike, but we don't have much choice. We have to keep looking. We have to figure out what's really happening." Both of them knew that the marks were just the beginning. They didn't need a doctor to tell them that. The air was thick with tension as Michael sat down at the table, his hands gripping the edge, his knuckles white. The conversation with Rasmus had left him unsettled, but it was more than just the marks on his shoulder. It was the realization that something far beyond their understanding was at play. Something had been happening to them, something they couldn't explain, and every strange event felt like a piece of a puzzle they couldn't yet see. As Rasmus spoke, Michael's mind raced. The 2 puncture marks on his friend's shoulder, so eerily similar to the ones found on the animals, lingered in his thoughts. But it wasn't just that. It was everything. The lights in the sky, the disappearing and reappearing animals, the feeling of dizziness that always followed their strange encounters. All of it was building toward something. But what? Michael's gaze flickered to Rasmus, who stood near the window, staring out at the expanse of their farmland. He could tell that Rasmus was struggling with the same questions. But Michael's thoughts had taken a darker turn. He wasn't just worried about what was happening to them now. He feared what would come next. He wasn't blind to the pattern. First, it was the animals disappearing, then Rasmus. Now the marks on him. The strange dreams. It was clear that whatever was taking them, or testing them, had moved on from the animals and was now focusing on them. Rasmus had already had his encounter with those figures, and though he hadn't been taken yet, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that his time was coming. He stood up, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him as he crossed the room to stand beside Rasmus. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Mike," Rasmus finally said, his voice low, as if he, too, was thinking the same thing. "I don't know what's going to happen next. I really don't. But I don't think we're safe here anymore." Michael swallowed, his throat dry. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell Rasmus that they could figure this out, that maybe they just needed to take a different approach. But the truth was, he didn't feel safe either. Not in this place, not in his own skin. His eyes met Rasmus's, and for a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped. They both knew that whatever was coming, they couldn't outrun it. They couldn't avoid it anymore. It was like an inevitable tide, pulling them in with no escape. And then, Michael realized it. He was next. After everything that had happened, he had no reason to believe he would be spared. He was already feeling the effects of his diabetes more than ever, and the way his body was deteriorating. It wasn't just his health slipping away. It was his life, his ability to fight back. The realization hit him harder than he expected. If the aliens, the figures, or whatever they were, had started with the animals, moved to Rasmus, then why wouldn't he be next? He had to be. Rasmus, seemingly sensing Michael's shift in demeanor, turned to face him, his eyes narrowing in concern. "Mike, what's wrong?" Michael ran a hand over his face, his fingers trembling slightly. I think I'm next," he whispered. The words felt strange as they left his lips, almost like they weren't his own. But he couldn't ignore the gnawing truth in his chest. He had been following the signs, watching the patterns unfold, and everything pointed to one thing. After Rasmus, they were coming for him. He could feel it in his bones. Rasmus opened his mouth to say something, but stopped. He could see it in Michael's eyes, the fear, the acceptance of something unavoidable. There were no words that could take away that feeling. Nothing either of them could say would change what they both knew was coming. "I don't know what to do, Mike." Rasmus said quietly, his voice breaking the heavy silence. I keep thinking maybe we're just going crazy, or maybe there's some rational explanation for all of this. But we can't keep pretending like this isn't real anymore. Michael nodded. The weight of the situation pressing down on him with a suffocating force. He couldn't pretend anymore. Not after everything they'd seen. Not after the marks on Rasmus's shoulder. The proof was right there in front of them, and whatever it wasn't stopping. It was getting closer. He looked out the window, his mind spinning with thoughts of what might happen next. What was waiting for them? Would they be taken in the middle of the night? Would they see those figures again? Would they be forced into some strange place, a place like the one Rasmus had dreamed of? I think we need to get ready, Michael said, his voice steady despite the dread crawling up his spine. Whatever happens, we need to be prepared. We need to stick together, Rasmus. We need to keep each other safe. Rasmus nodded, his face grim. Yeah, we'll stick together, but I don't know what we're preparing for anymore. It's like we're just waiting for something to happen. Something we can't stop. Michael swallowed hard. We might not be able to stop it, but we can make sure we're not alone when it happens. I don't want to face this, whatever it is, by myself. The two men stood in silence for a moment longer, the full weight of their situation settling over them. There was no way out of it. They were already in the thick of it. Whatever the future held, they had no choice but to face it head on. And deep down, Michael knew it was only a matter of time before the figures would come for him, just as they had for Rasmus. It would be his turn soon. The days stretched out quietly, almost eerily so. After the storm of strange occurrences, the farm had fallen into an uneasy stillness. The animals roamed the fields as they always had, and the once frequent flashes of light that had terrified both Michael and Rasmus had vanished. The sky seemed quieter now, the air thicker, but there was no sign of the strange beings, no more inexplicable phenomena. For a brief moment, it felt like everything might return to normal, even if only for a short while. Michael didn't know what to make of it. His mind kept returning to the chilling thought that this was just the calm before the storm. But there was a small part of him that hoped, desperately, that maybe, just maybe, they had been wrong all along. Maybe the lights were nothing more than a fluke, the animals simply wandering off. Perhaps their paranoia had gotten the best of them. It was the kind of fleeting hope that didn't last long. That morning, as Michael sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to convince himself that the tension in his chest was nothing more than stress, he heard the familiar sound of a truck pulling up outside. He glanced out the window, seeing Rasmus's old pickup truck come to a stop in front of the house. Rasmus's face appeared at the door a moment later, looking as serious as ever, but there was something different about him today, something less burdened. "Morning, Mike," Rasmus greeted, his voice unusually calm. He stepped inside and shut the door behind him, walking over to the table where Michael was sitting. "Morning," Michael replied, squinting at him. "What's going on?" Rasmus looked down at his shoulder, then back up at Michael. I don't know how to explain it, but the marks are gone. The 2 puncture marks from the other day, they've completely disappeared. Michael blinked, unsure he had heard right. "What do you mean? Gone?" Rasmus raised his sleeve, revealing his shoulder, but where the 2 small punctures had been just days ago, there was no trace, no redness, no swelling, not even a scab. It was as if the marks had never been there at all. Michael sat back in his chair, his eyebrows knitting together. "So, they just disappeared?" Rasmus nodded. "Yeah, I don't know how, but they're completely gone. And honestly, it feels like maybe we've been overthinking things. I went to the clinic to check on it, just to be sure, but the doctor said they weren't anything serious. Now, it's like nothing ever happened." Michael's heart skipped a beat, but this time it wasn't fear. It was confusion. He leaned forward, trying to wrap his mind around what Rasmus was saying. "You're saying you think it's nothing?" "Maybe," Rasmus said slowly. But his voice had softened, as if he too was unsure. "Maybe it was just some random thing, or maybe it was something I didn't notice. It's like the marks were never even there." Michael was quiet for a long moment, the unease still lingering in his chest despite Rasmus's words. The marks were gone, just like that. And not just on Rasmus, on the animals too. He had seen it himself, the mysterious punctures that had shown up on every missing animal. And now they, too, were gone without a trace. "That doesn't make sense," Michael muttered. "I mean, it was real, right? I saw those marks too, on the animals, on you. It's not just some trick of the mind." Rasmus shrugged, his face tight with frustration. "I don't know what to tell you, Mike. Maybe it's a coincidence, or maybe we just don't understand what's happening. I'm starting to wonder if all that strange stuff we've been seeing was just random. Maybe we were looking for something that wasn't really there." Michael's stomach churned. The idea of all of this just being a coincidence, a trick of their minds, didn't sit right with him. He had seen too much, felt too much. The dizziness that had come with the flashes of light, the strange dreams, they couldn't all be explained away so easily. "Maybe," Michael said slowly, his voice almost a whisper. "But I don't think it's over. I don't know what it means, but something's still not right, Rasmus." Rasmus looked at him, a heavy silence hanging between them. "I know, I feel it too." He ran a hand through his hair, clearly still processing the strange events of the past weeks. "But maybe it's just a break. Maybe we're getting some time to think things through, to figure it out before whatever happens next." Michael nodded absently, though his thoughts were racing. The calm they were experiencing now didn't feel like an end. It felt like the silence before the next wave. The strange feeling in his gut told him that whatever was happening was far from over. "So, what now?" Rasmus asked, breaking through Michael's thoughts. Michael leaned back in his chair, looking out the window at the wide-open fields surrounding the farm. The land was peaceful, but it seemed foreign now, as though it didn't belong to him anymore. "I don't know," Michael said quietly, "but I think we need to keep watching. We can't let our guard down. Not yet." Rasmus was silent for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "You're right. But for now, maybe we take the win. Maybe we just breathe for a minute before whatever's next hits." They both knew it wasn't over, that this strange chapter of their lives was far from finished. But for the first time in weeks, there was a sense of peace. A temporary break from the storm they knew was still coming. Michael awoke suddenly, the silence of the night shattered by a strange, penetrating glow that filled his room. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, another fragment of a nightmare that had somehow crept into his waking hours. But as he sat up in bed, his eyes squinting against the blinding light that streamed through his window, he knew this was different. The glow outside wasn't from a car nor a distant lightning strike. It wasn't the reflection of some passing plane either. It was far too bright, far too unnatural. His heart began to race, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. The light seemed to be pulling him in, drawing him from the safety of his bed toward the window. His limbs felt heavy, almost like he was in a trance, but at the same time, his body moved of its own accord. Slowly he stood, feeling the weight of his own legs beneath him, as if gravity itself had shifted. He crossed the room in a daze, his hand instinctively reaching for the window as the brightness intensified. His mind was spinning, yet something in him, something primal, urged him forward, toward the light. As he threw open the window, the cold night air hit him like a slap, but he barely noticed it. His eyes were locked on the shimmering brilliance just beyond the farm, the same eerie glow that he had seen before. This time, however, it was closer, much closer. And there, standing near the edge of the fields, Michael saw it. The figure, a tall humanoid form, standing motionless in the light. It was impossibly tall, at least 2 meters, its body elongated, limbs thin but defined. The figure's features were blurry, indistinct, but Michael felt its presence like a heavy weight pressing on him. It was real. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't his mind making up stories in the dead of night. His breath hitched. The humanoid's eyes, or at least what he assumed were eyes, seemed to glow faintly, 2 white orbs reflecting the strange light. The figure didn't move, but Michael felt an overwhelming sense of compulsion to go toward it, as though the light itself was pulling him. His feet were no longer under his control, his body moving with a force stronger than willpower itself. The air around him grew thicker, and the gravity seemed to shift again, dragging him toward the door. As he stepped outside, a sudden wave of dizziness struck him, much like the times he had felt before when the lights had appeared. His vision blurred, and his head spun as the light from the figure intensified, blurring the edges of the world around him. And then, without warning, the light seemed to engulf him. Michael gasped as his body lifted off the ground, the earth slipping away from beneath his feet. His senses were overwhelmed by the brightness, the pressure, and the sensation of being pulled upward. He couldn't fight it. His body seemed to levitate as the light continued to draw him in, a silent, irresistible force that took him further and further from the ground, from everything he knew. In an instant, everything around him changed. The air became sterile, and the weightlessness of the moment gave way to a cold, metallic chill. He felt his body settle onto something hard, his legs dangling as though suspended in midair. Slowly, his surroundings began to come into focus. He was inside a room. It was the same room Rasmus had described to him, the same stark white walls, the same faint hum of machinery that seemed to echo in the emptiness. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized the truth. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't his mind spinning out of control. He had been taken. The room was small, but his mind barely processed the space around him. All he could focus on were the figures moving silently around him. The humanoids. They were the same as the one he had seen outside. Tall, impossibly thin, their movements graceful but eerie, like they were gliding rather than walking. They didn't speak, but their presence filled the room with an almost suffocating weight. And then he saw it. In the center of the room, resting on the cold metallic floor, was the capsule Rasmus had spoken of. It was large, cylindrical, but its surface shimmered with a strange, iridescent glow, as though it were made of a material that didn't belong in this world. Michael's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. This was it. The place Rasmus had described, the place where they had been taken. He was here, too. The humanoids moved around him, their tall forms circling as though they were preparing for something. Michael's head spun as dizziness hit him again, the familiar sensation of losing control washing over him. He wanted to scream, to fight, but his body wouldn't respond. His vision began to blur once more, the edges of reality slipping away. The humanoids continued to move around him, but they didn't touch him. They didn't make any sounds. It was as if they were studying him, observing him from a distance. Michael couldn't make sense of it. His thoughts were scattered, disjointed, as the overwhelming pressure of the moment pushed him to the brink. He tried to reach for something, anything, to anchor himself to reality. But all he could do was watch as the figures hovered around him, each one as silent and distant as the last. He could feel their presence more than he could see them. And then, just as suddenly as the light had pulled him up, it began to fade. The dizziness intensified, and Michael's consciousness began to slip away as his body was lowered gently toward the cold surface beneath him. The room seemed to darken, and his last thoughts before everything went black were a faint whisper in his mind. This was real, and now there was no going back. The world around Michael was a blur. He couldn't focus, couldn't breathe properly as his head swam with dizziness. His limbs felt heavy, distant, like they weren't even his own. He had been here before, in this space between consciousness and darkness, but never like this. This wasn't some odd hallucination. This wasn't the dizzy spell from earlier. This was his body screaming for help. Diabetes, Michael thought, struggling to clear his mind. It's the diabetes. It's happening again. His blood sugar was plummeting. He could feel it, the cold sweat, the tremors creeping up his arms, the tightness in his chest. The insulin he had taken earlier that day had been a temporary fix, but it was never enough to counter the constant imbalance of his body. Not now, not when his stress and exhaustion were at their peak. His body wasn't just rejecting the world around him, it was rejecting itself. And that meant one thing: he needed insulin, now. But as his thoughts turned inward, he suddenly noticed something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The humanoids had stopped moving. They were watching him now, but not with the silent efficiency he had seen before. No, this time they were acting. Confused. The way they looked at him was different, their head tilting slightly, as if trying to decipher what was happening to him. They moved closer, but their movements were slow, almost hesitant. One of them reached out a long, thin arm, but then paused, as if uncertain of what to do next. Michael's mind was foggy, but he could still sense the change in the air. The tension had shifted. They weren't observing him like they had before. Now, they seemed worried or at least perplexed. His vision swam again, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he tried to lift them. Insulin. Need insulin. His mouth was dry, his throat tight, and he couldn't think straight. But somehow, even through the haze, he knew he had to get a grip on the situation. He felt the distinct pull in his stomach, the deep ache of desperation, his body begging him for the medicine that he couldn't get here. There was no insulin. There were no syringes. Nothing. His chest tightened, the feeling of impending doom pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't escape. The humanoids seemed to notice the change in him more clearly now. They stepped closer, their movements quicker, more erratic. Michael could see their pale faces shift, their elongated features knitting together in what almost looked like frustration. One of them raised its hand, and Michael, in a moment of panic, flinched. But instead of touching him, the figure hovered just above his skin, like it was testing some invisible barrier, trying to understand what was wrong with him. The being's long fingers curled in the air, as if uncertain of what to do next. Michael gasped for air, his breath shallow. His heart pounded in his chest, and his vision narrowed to a tunnel. He could feel the edges of his consciousness fading, his body shutting down as his blood sugar fell to dangerous levels. "Help," he whispered, his voice hoarse. The word came out more like a breath than anything coherent. He didn't even know if they understood. Did they? Did they know what was happening to him? They moved closer still, and one of them extended its arm again. This time, Michael could see something strange. It wasn't just a motion. It was a series of sharp, calculated movements. The being was trying to interpret his condition, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. They don't understand, Michael realized with a start. They're confused. They don't know what this is. In that moment, he understood something crucial. The humanoids, for all their advanced technology and alien presence, had no idea what it was like to suffer from something like diabetes. Their silence, their uncertainty, told him everything. The panic surged again. His body was shutting down. He could feel the faint sting of sweat running down his face, the desperate heat rising in his chest. The cold of the metal room seemed to press deeper into his bones as his body slowed. The humanoid closest to him reached out again, its fingers trembling ever so slightly. But Michael couldn't focus on it. The blackness at the edges of his vision was growing stronger, and the world seemed to pull away from him like a distant memory. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. "I need insulin." And then, just as the darkness began to swallow him whole, he felt a strange sensation. A gentle, almost delicate pressure on his arm. The humanoid had reached out to him again, but this time there was something different. Its touch was cool, calming, and for the briefest moment, Michael felt a flicker of awareness. He wasn't alone. Something was happening, but he couldn't make sense of it. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the glimmer of the alien's form, hovering just above him, and its face, blank, yet somehow concerned. It was an odd, unspoken understanding. Whatever they were, whatever they wanted from him, this moment was one of helplessness. They didn't know how to help. They didn't understand human vulnerability. But something in their gaze, something in the way they circled around him, told Michael that they weren't completely indifferent. And then, his mind finally slipped away into darkness. Michael's mind drifted back slowly, like a river that had been dammed, only to break free in slow, jagged bursts. At first, everything was nothing but fragments, broken images, blurry sensations. His legs felt heavy, unresponsive, and he couldn't seem to lift them, like they were weighed down by invisible chains. But somehow, they moved. They dragged him forward, across a cold, metallic floor, as if his body was moving without him. He was aware of the coldness beneath him, the strange, alien surface beneath his back. Slowly, the disorientation began to ebb, and he realized that he had been placed on some sort of table. It wasn't the capsule that he had seen earlier, the one that Rasmus had described, but a long, flat surface, cold to the touch, and seemingly out of place in the room. The humanoids moved around him like silent, graceful shadows. Their presence was overwhelming, yet quiet, an unsettling calm. They were tall, unnervingly tall, and their movements were deliberate, almost methodical. They circled him, hovering near the edges of his consciousness, not quite touching him, but always within his line of sight. He couldn't move his head much, but he could feel their presence, and that was enough. A strange, pulsing light from above bathed the room, shimmering in different hues. But the most prominent was the deep, rich purple. It streaked across the air like luminous tendrils, cutting through the darkness and casting eerie shadows on the walls. They hovered above the table, passing over him in waves, undulating like beams of energy. Michael's body involuntarily tensed, his breath shallow, as the first wave of purple light washed over him. It was like an invisible force pressing down on him, heavy yet intangible. The light bathed him, wrapping around him like tendrils, and for a moment he felt both weightless and tethered to the table at the same time. Something strange happened next. As the beams of purple light swept over his body, they seemed to draw a strange kind of energy from within him. Something that resonated, deeply and painfully, from the pit of his stomach. His body felt like it was responding involuntarily, like the light was pulling something from him, something vital. And then suddenly, the pain came. It was sharp. It started from his eyes, the sensation blooming outward like a wildfire. His vision blurred again, but this time, it wasn't just the dizziness of low blood sugar. This was different. This was intense, burning. A searing light, bright and blinding, pierced through his skull. The pain was like fire itself, and he couldn't escape it. His eyes, his vision, flared with an unnatural pink light. It wasn't just the beams above. No, this was something inside him, something invading his very senses. His head swam in a riot of colors, and the pink light stabbed through his pupils, searing into the depths of his mind. And in the midst of that painful, fiery glow, he could hear a faint hum, a soft mechanical whirring in the background. The humanoids were still walking around him, observing. Yet they didn't seem to be doing anything to help. They weren't touching him, but their presence was heavy, suffocating, as if they were waiting for something to happen, waiting for him to react. But Michael couldn't move. He couldn't do anything. His body was locked in place, paralyzed by the light, by the sheer force of the beams that seemed to be altering him, reshaping him somehow. His vision flickered, the pink light flashing brighter in his mind as the pain grew unbearable. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the light intensified, blinding him completely. It's too much, he thought, the words barely forming in his mind. I can't take this. Not again. Not now. But it was too late. His mind, already teetering on the edge of collapse, slipped into oblivion. The world around him dissolved in a sudden rush of nothingness, and he felt himself falling deeper into the blackness, away from everything. The pain was gone now, replaced by a weightless void. He no longer felt the table beneath him, nor the presence of the humanoids. There was only the darkness, deep and endless. He lost consciousness. Michael's return to consciousness was slow, like the painful unfurling of a broken dream. He could feel the lingering weight of the light, the aftertaste of the violet energy that had swept over him, but the pain was gone. In its place was a strange emptiness. His mind was foggy, a haze that left him struggling to recall what had just happened, what he had just experienced. His body felt foreign, disconnected. The overwhelming presence of the humanoids lingered in his peripheral vision, but when he tried to move his limbs, his muscles seemed to resist him. He couldn't remember how he'd gotten here, or what here even was. His surroundings were unfamiliar, cold, metallic, with sterile walls and a low hum that buzzed in his ears. But then he felt it again, a tugging at his feet. His legs moved, almost involuntarily, as though guided by an unseen force. The humanoids surrounded him, their tall forms looming in the periphery of his vision, their movements almost silent. They didn't touch him, but their presence was undeniable. It took Michael a moment to realize what was happening, what they were doing. They were guiding him toward the capsule, the one Rasmus had described to him, the one he had seen before, the one he had almost been placed in earlier, back when everything was still a distant, surreal dream. The capsule. He felt himself being gently pushed into it, his legs guided into the open, cold interior. The feeling was familiar, even though he couldn't remember when it had first begun. His body was placed inside the capsule, the cold surface pressing against his skin as the humanoids worked with precision. They moved him as if he were an object, a thing to be placed and observed, not a person. As soon as he was fully inside, the lid of the capsule began to close. The sound of the metal shifting, locking into place, echoed in his mind. A soft hiss of air filled the space around him. It was happening again. The cold confinement, the quiet indifference of the humanoids. He had no control over his body, no control over his mind. Before the capsule sealed completely, Michael's last thought was one of confusion. Was this what they wanted? Was this what they were doing to him all along? And then the world went black. The next thing Michael knew, his eyes fluttered open. He didn't know how much time had passed. He didn't know where he was. But one thing was clear. He was no longer in that strange, sterile place. He wasn't surrounded by the aliens or their hums and lights. No, he was back home. His surroundings were warm, familiar. His own farmhouse. He could hear the distant sound of wind whistling through the trees and the faint chirping of birds outside his window. It felt like everything was just as it had been before the strange lights and the abductions, before everything had turned upside down. But something inside him was different. He could feel it. His body felt lighter, healthier. He couldn't explain it, but there was a clarity, a sense of calm in his mind that he hadn't felt in years. It was like he had woken up from a nightmare, only to realize that his illness, the diabetes that had plagued him for so long, was gone. He sat up in bed, confused, his heart racing. He glanced around the room, trying to make sense of what had happened, but all he could hear was the quiet hum of life outside. There was no sign of the strange visitors, no sign of the capsule or the aliens. He swung his legs off the bed, the floor cool beneath his feet, and stood, shaky at first, but then with more confidence. The pain in his joints was gone. The weight in his chest that had been there for so long had lifted. He could move without the fatigue that had haunted him every day. His body didn't feel like it was betraying him anymore. Michael took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the table beside his bed. His medication, his insulin. He glanced at it, and then, almost as if by instinct, he pulled it away, setting it aside. What is happening to me? He thought. What are they doing to me? His mind was spinning with questions, but at the same time, there was a strange peace that settled over him. He wasn't sure if it was the absence of his illness or the quiet realization that he had come back from something he couldn't quite understand. But before he could ponder further, the sound of a knock at the door pulled him back to reality. Rasmus. Michael wasn't sure what to expect anymore. The last few days, the strange occurrences, everything. He didn't know where it had left him. But somehow, he knew he couldn't keep these experiences to himself. He needed answers. He got up from the bed and walked toward the door, his movements light and easy. As he opened it, he was met with Rasmus's concerned gaze. "I thought I heard something," Rasmus said, stepping inside. "You okay?" Michael looked at his old friend, unsure how to begin. "I don't know. I think I'm okay. But you need to hear this." Michael took a deep breath and began recounting everything that had happened. The lights in the sky, the strange disappearances of the animals, the way his life had been twisted by an inexplicable force, and the moments when the humanoids had come to him, surrounding him with their unsettling presence. He spoke of the feeling of being drawn to the capsule, of the strange light that had overwhelmed him, and how, for what seemed like an eternity, he had been trapped in that alien space. Rasmus listened in stunned silence, his face a mix of disbelief and concern. The tension between them was palpable. Michael could tell that Rasmus was struggling to make sense of it all, just as he was. Yet, there was something in his friend's eyes that made Michael feel as if he wasn't being dismissed, as if there was a part of Rasmus that believed him, even if the rest of him couldn't quite wrap his head around it. When Michael finished, he felt a weight lift off his chest, but there was still that gnawing uncertainty in his gut. What did it all mean? Was it over, or was this just the beginning? Rasmus shifted uneasily, his gaze drifting to the space where Michael had been sitting. I don't know what to think, Mike," he said slowly. "But one thing's for sure. Whatever happened, it's not just in your head. Too many strange things have been happening here. And I think you might be right." Michael looked at him, unsure of what he meant. Right about what? Rasmus's eyes darkened, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face. "We need to check something I forgot to tell you before." Michael raised an eyebrow, but before he could ask, Rasmus stepped forward, his face tense. Let me see your shoulder. Michael blinked in surprise. What? Rasmus's tone was firm, insistent. You heard me. Let me see your shoulder. Michael hesitated for a moment, confused by the urgency in his friend's voice. But then something clicked in his mind. He remembered Rasmus's words from earlier, the mention of the 2 puncture marks on his own shoulder, the ones that had been found on the animals. Could it be? With a shaky sigh, Michael pulled up his sleeve, revealing his shoulder. He hadn't thought about it much, not after everything that had happened. He had been too focused on the strange disappearance of his illness, on the overwhelming sensation of peace that had come with it. But now, as he looked at Rasmus, he saw the same intensity in his eyes that had been there when they had first discussed the marks on the animals. Rasmus knelt down, his fingers gently grazing Michael's shoulder as he leaned in to examine the skin. Michael could feel his breath hitch in his chest, his heart pounding as Rasmus prodded the area. After a long, tense silence, Rasmus straightened up, his face pale. Mike, they're there, right on your shoulder. Michael blinked, his pulse quickening. What do you mean? What's there? Rasmus's voice was quiet, almost too quiet. The 2 marks, just like the ones on the animals, the punctures, they're still there. Michael's eyes widened in shock. He couldn't believe it. He hadn't noticed them before. The strange marks, 2 small, perfectly round punctures in his skin, almost as if they had been made by some kind of needle. They were faint but unmistakable, nestled in the muscle of his upper arm. Michael reached up to touch the marks, his fingers trembling. They were real. They were there. His mind raced. How had he not noticed this before? Had the humanoids done this to him, just like they had to the animals? And why? What did these marks mean? Rasmus stood up slowly, his hand on Michael's shoulder, his expression a mixture of fear and confusion. This isn't over, Mike, he said softly. Whatever they're doing, whatever they've done to you, it's not finished. And now, I think we're both in it. Michael looked up at him, his heart heavy with dread and uncertainty. The marks on his shoulder were just the beginning of something much bigger, something neither of them fully understood yet. He could feel it in his bones. But what were the humanoids planning next? Why had they left him with these marks? And why had they spared him when they had taken so much from him already? He looked at Rasmus, the weight of their shared uncertainty hanging in the air between them. The strange quiet was almost suffocating. I don't know what they want from us, Rasmus, Michael said, his voice thick with exhaustion. But I do know one thing. Rasmus glanced at him, waiting for him to continue. We need to find out, whatever it takes. And with that, the silence between them deepened as the 2 men stood together, caught in the grip of something far beyond their understanding. Michael sat in the sterile white room, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above almost deafening in its quietness. His hands rested on his lap, the familiar weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. His mind was swirling with questions, questions he couldn't answer, questions no one could answer. Yet he had come here to find something solid, something that might make sense of all this madness. Dr. Harris, his longtime physician, had been the one to suggest these tests. Let's take a look, Michael. We'll run everything again, make sure there's no hidden issue. It's better to be thorough, he had said with his usual calm demeanor. But even Dr. Harris had seemed uneasy. Something was off. Michael could sense it. When the nurse came in to collect the final samples, Michael's thoughts wandered back to everything that had happened in the last few weeks. The lights, the animals, the marks, the strange feeling that had gripped him whenever he thought about the humanoids. And now, the inexplicable health changes that had come over him. There was no doubt in his mind that something far outside his understanding was at play. The wait seemed interminable, but eventually, Dr. Harris returned to the room, his face betraying a rare sense of confusion. He didn't even sit down at first. Instead, he stood in front of Michael, rubbing the back of his neck as if searching for the right words. Michael could tell this wasn't going to be good news. Michael, Dr. Harris began, his voice steady but tinged with something unrecognizable. I've reviewed your results, and frankly, I'm at a loss. Michael's stomach tightened, but he remained silent, waiting for the doctor to continue. I don't understand this, Dr. Harris continued, a frown creasing his brow. All of your tests, all of them, they're perfect, no sign of diabetes. No indication of any kind of illness, past or present. Your blood sugar levels, your kidney function, your cholesterol, all of it, normal. I mean, these numbers, they don't match your age. They don't match the severity of your previous condition. Michael's eyes widened as his heart skipped a beat. Perfect? No trace of diabetes? He had been struggling with the disease for years, his body constantly fighting against the weight of it. He had been on insulin therapy, carefully managing his symptoms, dealing with the daily struggle. And now his results were perfect? I don't understand, Dr. Harris muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. I've been practicing medicine for over 20 years, Michael. I've never seen anything like this. This doesn't happen. Not like this. Not for someone in your condition, with your history. Michael swallowed hard, feeling a knot form in his throat. What does this mean, doctor? His voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. Dr. Harris paused, his eyes searching Michael's face. It means that your diabetes, it's gone. Completely. In fact, the tests don't show any signs of abnormality anywhere. You're in better shape than most people half your age. This is... He stopped himself and began again, trying to find the right words. It's practically unheard of, Michael. There are a few cases in medical literature where conditions seem to resolve mysteriously, but they're rare and never this dramatic. What happened to you? I can't explain. Michael's mind raced. It didn't make sense. It couldn't. His body had been ravaged by the disease for so long. And now, after everything that had happened, after the strange lights in the sky, the disappearance of the animals, and the bizarre encounters with the humanoids, this sudden remission, it felt like a cruel twist of fate, like there was some larger hidden force at play. But what was it? And why him? Dr. Harris leaned back in his chair, massaging his temples as if trying to stave off a headache. These things, these kinds of miracles, they don't make sense. They can't be explained by science. If I didn't know better, I'd say it's like your body reset itself. But that's just not possible. There's no scientific basis for it. Michael stared at him, the weight of the doctor's words sinking in. This was bigger than he had thought. Whatever had happened to him, it wasn't just the disappearance of his symptoms. It was something impossible. Do you think it was the result of some treatment? Michael asked, his voice trembling slightly. Dr. Harris looked at him, a tired expression on his face. Treatment? I wish I could say that was the case, but I didn't do anything that could have caused this, Michael. This is beyond anything I've ever seen. Michael's thoughts flickered back to the strange events, the lights, the figures, the marks, and a realization began to settle heavily on his chest. He knew in his gut that whatever had happened to him wasn't just a fluke. It wasn't some miracle cure. He had been part of something bigger, something far beyond anything he could have ever imagined. And the question that loomed over everything, what did the humanoids want from him? What did they do to him? Was this all part of their plan? Or had he just been an unwitting pawn in some larger game? I can't give you any answers, Dr. Harris continued, his voice softer now. But I'll keep an eye on you, Michael. If anything changes, anything at all, don't hesitate to come back. I'll be here. Michael nodded absently, still trying to process the enormity of what he had just heard. Thanks, doctor. As he left the clinic, the questions swirled around him like a storm. Whatever had happened, whatever was happening, it was far from over. He could feel it in his bones, and soon he realized he would have to face it head on. The lights would come again, the figures would return, and this time he would be ready. Part 32. The Calm After the Storm. Michael returned to the farm, his mind still reeling from the events at the clinic. He had hoped for clarity, for some kind of answer that would help make sense of everything that had happened to him. But all he had now were more questions, and an unsettling sense that things were far from over. As he entered the farmhouse, he found Rasmus sitting at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee. His expression was calm, though Michael could sense a lingering tension in the air. How'd it go at the doctor's? Rasmus asked without looking up. Michael sat down across from him, rubbing his temples. Everything's normal, no sign of diabetes. The tests were perfect. He paused, letting the words sink in. I don't understand it. It's like my body reset itself, but it doesn't make sense. Rasmus raised an eyebrow, still watching Michael carefully. It's strange, for sure, but you're not the only one who's been changed by all of this. Michael leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. There's something else. The last thing I remember before they put me in that capsule. They placed me on a table first, Rasmus. I thought it was just part of the process. But now I think they were doing something else. They were healing me. They didn't want me to go into the capsule sick. They needed me alive. But they didn't care about curing me. They just needed me healthy enough to be put in the capsule. Rasmus looked stunned. Wait, you're telling me they weren't trying to heal you at all? They just wanted you alive so they could put you in the capsule? Michael nodded slowly, the realization dawning on him as he spoke. Exactly. I think their goal was never to make me better. It was always about getting a living human into that capsule. They needed someone who was alive to do whatever they were doing. And whatever happened after that, when they put me in the capsule, I'm not sure, but I think it was part of their plan all along. Rasmus sat back in his chair, his mind clearly processing the implications of what Michael had just said. That makes sense. They never wanted to cure you. They just needed you intact. To them, you were nothing more than a vessel, a means to an end. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the realization heavy between them. The strange lights, the humanoids, the mysterious procedures, they had all been part of something far larger than either of them could understand. But it wasn't just about Michael. It was about a purpose, a mission, something that had come from beyond their comprehension. Weeks passed after that night. The lights never returned. The figures, the strange phenomenon that had been a part of their lives for so long, simply disappeared. Life on the farm slowly returned to something resembling normalcy, though it was clear to both Michael and Rasmus that the events they had witnessed had changed them. They had learned too much. The mystery of the lights, the creatures, the experiments, it was all too much to ignore. But now it seemed like they had vanished, leaving them with only memories of an experience that couldn't be explained. Rasmus turned to Michael one evening, as they both stood on the porch, looking out over the fields that stretched for miles in the fading light. "Do you think they'll ever come back?" he asked quietly. Michael thought for a long moment, the cool evening air swirling around them. "I don't know, but for now, it feels like they've done what they came for. They've studied us, taken what they needed, and left. Maybe they'll be back someday, or maybe they've moved on to somewhere else. But I think we're done with them. For now, at least." Rasmus nodded, his gaze never leaving the horizon. "I guess we can only wait and see." The peace that had settled over the farm was strange and almost unnerving, like the calm before a storm. But for the moment, Michael was grateful for the silence. It was the kind of quiet that spoke volumes, the kind of quiet that could only come after something extraordinary had taken place. And as the weeks turned into months, it became clear that whatever the humanoids had wanted, they had gotten. The lights, the strange happenings, the abductions, all of it had faded away. Perhaps they had left for good. Or perhaps they were just waiting, watching from afar. But whatever the future held, Michael knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The end. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories.